Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf mem hey. Very excited to be starting our tiny challenge today. So if you're starting, good luck with your learning. It's the first day we say v'tein talu notar in Israel. And if you're wondering why we say v'tein talu notar in Israel on Zayim or Cheshvan, but outside of Israel, it starts on December 4th, which is always a very strange thing. So in Masechet Tani, you will find the answer to that. We're going to get started now with our daf, though. We're back to Zevachim. And today we're going to even ask the question, why are we learning Zevachim? The Gemara is going to even talk about it. So we're going to start with just a quick review. We ended our daf with this opinion of Rabbi Elazar, which was this in-between opinion about the chatot pnimiyot. We saw there was in the Mishnah a debate between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis. Is there pigul by the chatot pnimiyot, or is it only things that are like shlamim that are done on the outer altar? Either completely yes, completely no. Then we ended up with this in-between approach, which was Rabbi Elazar in the name of Rabbi Yosi, who basically said that it's like shlamim in that everything has to happen on the outer altar, but it could relate to the things that are brought on the inner altar as long as two things. One, your thought is happening at a moment, your pigul thought is happening at a moment where you happen to be not inside, like you're doing the slaughtering or the collecting of the blood or walking it toward the sanctuary, but not yet in the sanctuary. And the thought that you're thinking about that you're going to do chutz mano has to be an action that's supposed to take place outside, meaning like the imurim are going to be burned or the meat's going to be eaten beyond its time. Okay, and that's how we can have pigul according to him. And we end of Mem Daled, I'm a bet at the bottom. I'm Rav Nachman, I'm Rav Ravua, I'm Rav halakha ki Rabbi Elazar shamar mishum Rabbi Yosi. We actually paskin like him, which raises a whole question. I'm a Rava, okay, or some people say it's Rav Yosef. Hilchata l'mashicha. Why are we paskening halacha for something that's going to be only when the Mashiach comes and we rebuild the third temple? What's the point of paskening halacha for something that's totally irrelevant right now? Okay, on the beyond the daf in the Hebrew side of our site, we have the Hebrew Shiurim. We have Dr. Mirav Tubukana, who actually gave her shiurs up this week now about Hilchata l'mashicha. And one of the things she suggests is that part of the issue with paskening halacha for a time that's irrelevant is that maybe once we get there, there'll be different criteria for paskening, right? It might not even be relevant. But if we stick right now with like, why are we learning this? What does this have to do with anything? We don't bring korbanot anymore. So, Amar le'Abaye, Abaye's response is, Elameata, kosh tab kodashim lo litnei. Well, then why are we learning anything about kodashim if that's the case? Okay, in other words, don't ask your question about why are we pasking halacha here for something irrelevant. Why are we even learning kodashim? Hilchata l'mashichu. The whole thing is not relevant anymore, and only relevant at some future point. Ela drosh v'kabel sachal. So why do we learn all of kodashim? In order to learn and get rewarded. Now, this statement doesn't really mean we're doing it for the reward, right? You're not allowed to learn Torah for the reward. The point is, it's Torah and we should learn it. Hachanami drosh v'kabel sachar. So I'll answer your question in the same way. Why are we paskening halacha? Because we want to know who's got the quote-unquote right answer, right? We know there's never any real right answer, but who will we hold like if this were happening? It's just part of the learning process. So, what's the response of either Rav Yosef or Rava? Hachi kamin alach. Hilchata lamali. What I was asking is why are we passing halacha? And this goes back to what I was saying Merav said. In other words, I understand why we're learning this, drosh v'kabel sachar, but to paskin halacha is really not so relevant right now. And like I said, perhaps based on what Merav was saying, maybe even what the psak now is not going to necessarily be the psak in the future. Or lishan achrina, or a different version, it's just different wording, it means the same thing. Amalei halakha. I mean, I've met the halacha. What was bothering me was the fact that we're paskening, not the fact that we're learning it. Now, this just begs the question of really why is there Seder Kodshim in the Bavli and there isn't in the Yerushalmi? And that's really an interesting question, because, or there's two questions really. Why is there Seder Kodshim in the Bavli and there's no Zraim, for example? Right? Zra'im, of all the things that are connected to the land, are not in the Bavli. They are in the Yerushalmi. And in the Yerushalmi, they have that and they don't have this. So first of all, there was someone in 1907, okay, and I put this in the chat for those who want to read it a little bit, but there was someone, I brought a little section about, you can ignore the top, but in January 1907, Shlomo Yehuda Al-Ghazi, Friedlander, published in Hungary what he claimed was the long-lost tractates of Seder Kodshim of the Yerushalmi. And basically all these rabbis, very well-known rabbis, gave him haskamot and said, wow, it's amazing you found this. And basically he claimed that there was a Yerushalmi and it was just lost. Okay, it turns out he had forged the entire thing, which is an unbelievable thing, to write a Seder of Yerushalmi, forget about Bavli, right, and forge it. Crazy. And he basically forged it, and they proved it was a forgery, and by 1913 everyone realized that it was a forgery, and that was the end of it, and it got, buried, so to speak. That's just a really interesting story, and it really didn't happen so long ago. It's pretty fascinating. So you can search it up and read up about it. It's really interesting. So that's first of all. The second thing I want to talk about, I don't really have an answer, okay? This is not something I'm going to be able to answer, but I did find an article that I put the link up in the chat. If anybody wants it, you can write me. I'll send you the link. An article in Asif. It's a Hebrew article, so you have to be able to read in Hebrew, but I'll tell you the bottom line of it. I didn't read everything, but it's a super interesting article. It was written by a man named Shmuel Yorman, and he basically, what he did was, he said he wanted to do, and he did a statistical analysis of also the Bavli, also the Yerushalmi, about things that are no longer relevant. Okay, particularly I think he did it in Kodshim, I don't recall. But what he wanted to show is two things that you would think were intuitively correct, which is, number one, as the generations get farther away, remember the Gemara is written, right, it starts being written 130 years after the destruction of the temple. And he figures the more we get away from the destruction of the temple, the less you're going to have discussions of the destruction of the temple. So what did he do? He took statements of Amoraim, and I don't know exactly what he took, but he did this analysis. Again, statistics you could always play with, but he did this analysis, taking who and what generation were discussing these things, to try to see if as time went on, there were less discussions about these things that are less relevant. As time goes on, less relevant. And he compared Amoraim in Israel and Amoraim in Babylonia. And what he basically proved is the opposite of what you would think would be true. And he proved that the more the generations got farther away from the temple, they actually delved more into this than they had before. And the more, obviously, there could be all sorts of considerations that could affect this. Maybe just in general, the later generations delved into things. So it's statistics. But it is interesting. He has charts and pie charts and all sorts of tables there that analyze the statistics. I did not go in depth about it. But he basically says that what I just proved strengthens the claim that Magamara Talmud einam mistapeket b'psikot halakha l'shelat hador. That what interested the Gemara was not paskening halacha for the people of their generation. It really, and it's a beautiful paragraph he has, HaTalmud makifet kol chalkei Torah, right? The Talmud includes all the parts of the Torah, even ones that are not halacha l'maaseh in the tkufa of the Amoraim in their time period. And it's basically viewed as, this is a book that's for generations. And anyway, and then he quotes, the claim of Abaye to Rav Yosef, that even though it's not relevant, right, and the drosh v'kabel sachal, he says, that's really what their belief was, and they weren't going to ignore any Torah. And then he basically says that in Eretz Yisrael, it's actually less, okay, and he proves it. And anyway, it's kind of really an interesting article, again, it's a theory. Do what you want with it. I thought it was very interesting that somebody did statistical analysis like that of the Talmud. I thought that was super interesting. And then if you think about it, like another thought about Kodshim versus Zera'im, why they chose Kodshim, I think it's pretty obvious, because sacrifices are a more central role in, it's true that they're both dependent on Israel and dependent. I mean, you would think, the ones dependent on Israel are actually dependent they're laws forever. They're still relevant nowadays, but they weren't relevant to them in Babylonia. But the idea of korbanot is the way we worship God, right? It's much more connection to God in that mitzvah. And perhaps because of that, they thought it was much more central. Also, our prayers are keneged the korbanot. And for that reason, I think he really the Bavli probably chose to teach that instead of Zra'im. I don't know if it was that instead of that. But anyway, it's an interesting thought. There's no real good answer. And right. So Becky, you're saying about the fact that Mashiach is coming, we have to be prepared. We also have to be prepared for Zra'im, for all the mitzvot we're going to have to do when we're in the land. Right? It's classic, by the way. I know this is, someone who's seen this many times, people move to Israel, they have trees in their garden, and until they figure out that, I have to take Trumot Masrot, like they don't even realize. So it's also very relevant. So anyway, these are just interesting things to think about, and I didn't want to ignore it today, because here it is straight on. And if you want to know why we should be learning Kodshim, right, even though it's quite difficult, I saw a very funny video that was going around about, I find the whole thing so funny, but it was like someone complaining why his thought and what the Kohen messed us all up, and because of his thoughts, and then basically he says at the end, and because of that, we're all learning all these, we're struggling in Daf Yomi of all the, just because of this thought of the Kohen, it causes us, these struggles. So anyway, okay, with that, we're going to get on to our next topic. Today is a very interesting topic now. Kodshe Goyim, or by you it might say Ovdei Kochavim. There's all different versions. It's always like that with the censorship of what we call non-Jews. I also always struggle with what word to use. It's complicated. What the proper word to use that's not necessarily derogatory, right? You don't want to be derogatory about how you call them. Anyway, I don't have a great answer. But Kodshe Goyim. So we have sacrifices of non-Jews. Ein chayavim alehem mishum pigul notar v'tamei. Vashoktam b'chutz patur divrei Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says if they bring sacrifices. Now, what's interesting enough is that they can bring sacrifices, and this is learned out from the pasuk. Okay, it's a pasuk in Vayikra chapter 22, verse 18. Ish mi beit Yisrael umenager b'Yisrael asher yakriv korbano l'chol nidreihem l'chol nidvatam asher yakrivu la'Hashem la'olah. Ish, a person, a man. Okay, why does it say it twice? To include non-Jews. Okay, non-Jews are included here. That if you want to bring a neder and a derive, they can bring voluntary offerings. Okay, they can't bring obligatory offerings, but they can bring voluntary. There's a machloket about whether they can only bring olot, which are burned completely, or can they even bring shlamim, which they get to eat. That's a machloket, not here, but it's a machloket. So now, what we're talking about, so number one, they can bring them, some. Okay, not all. They can't bring obligatory offerings. If they do a sin, they can't bring a sin offering. But if they do, according to Rabbi Shimon, it's a different track. All the rules that we learn, pigul, notar, tamei, okay, pigul thought, you ruin the korban and then you eat it. Notar, it's left over beyond the given time and you eat it. Tamei, it becomes impure and you eat it. All of those are not relevant to sacrifices of non-Jews. Vashoktam b'chutz patur, and if you slaughter them outside the temple, like if you're a Jew and you slaughter outside the temple, you're liable. Here, slaughter outside the temple, you're not liable. That's derive Rabbi Shimon. He views this as a completely different track. Rabbi Yosi mechayev. Rabbi Yosi says, what are you talking about? It's a sacrifice. It's like all our sacrifices. There's no difference between it, and you're liable. Okay, for all these things. Now we're going to bring a baraita that also lists those things in the machloka between Rabbi Yosi and Rabbi Shimon, but it's going to actually delete one of them. It doesn't have a shoktam b'chutz, and it's going to add a bunch more. So it begs the question, I don't have an answer to this, why the Mishnah didn't mention these others and why the baraita didn't mention shchutei chutz, but either which way we're going to have a bit of a more expanded list. And I just want to mention, it's definitely a very good shiur to listen to. Rabbi Shimoni talks about this from a machshavti perspective, from a she delves into it from different approaches in the Rishonim about how to view this, which starts really from Rabbi Yosi and Rabbi Shimon already in the Tanaitic time period, and then develops throughout the generations, also to the Rishonim of different approaches to how to understand how are they different, are they inherently different, are they not, and a really good analysis with some thought behind the whole thing, like what's the idea here and why would they be different. It's very interesting. So it's a good shiur, a short shiur to listen to. There's certain topics that are really worth going in depth about if you have the time. So the baraita says, Kodshe goyim lo nehenim v'lo mo'alim. Okay, so the kodshim of non-Jews, you can't, here's a new one, you can't benefit from them, but lo mo'alim, but there's no me'ilah. Okay, what is me'ilah? Misuse of consecrated property. It's basically benefiting. So what does it mean you can't benefit, but there's no me'ilah? This we're going to see a lot in kodshim. It means it's a code name for it's only asher midurabanan. Okay? It's only rabbinic. By Torah law, there's no me'ilah, because me'ilah is what the Torah law of using consecrated property. So, if you use it and benefit from it for your own sake, it's not forbidden by Torah law. But the rabbi said, don't benefit. Okay? In other words, it's still something sanctified to God, so stay away from it. But by Torah law, it doesn't fit if you use it benefit from it by accident, you don't have to bring the asham me'ilot and all that. Ve'en chayavim alehem mishum pigul notar tamei, that we saw in the Mishnah. Ve'en osim tmura. Okay, here's another law that's not relevant. Soon we're going to go through one by one, and where do we get this from the Torah that these don't apply to non-Jews? We're going to have drasha. Oh, it says Bnei Israel here. Oh, it says Bnei Israel here. It says Bnei Israel here. All that. Ve'en osim tmura. Ein osim tmura means, remember, substitution. We're going to have a whole masechet tmura. Just wait. It means if I substitute an animal in place of this animal, right, I say, oh, I designated this animal for sacrifice. I decide I want a different one. Whether you want a better one or a worse one, it doesn't matter. You're not allowed to do that. But if you do it, the second one becomes sanctified. You have to bring it as well. If a non-Jew does that, according to Rabbi Shimon, the second one isn't sanctified at all. It's just not effective. Ve'ein mevi'im nisachim. You don't bring libations. Okay, this is a bit tricky. As we're going to see later. They're actually... Okay, libations could mean two things. There's you decide voluntarily you want to bring libations, like a voluntary offering. They can't do that. But not only that, there's sacrifices that you're supposed to bring libations with. Certain kinds of sacrifice, like an ola, comes with libations. So you know that from your davening. Umin chatam vidniskehem kemidubar, right? There's certain sacrifices you bring on the holidays, or on Shabbos. You have to bring the nisachim along with them. Now, those are olot. So if you bring a korban olah, burnt offering, it comes in nisachim, and if you're a non-Jew, you can't bring them. So now what's the problem is that you're actually obligating them, but you can't bring them. So someone else can bring instead of you. The big question becomes, there's a debate about this, who pays for it? Some people say that the non-Jew can't even pay for it, okay, and have someone do it for them. So actually, it then comes from, according to that opinion, it comes from public funds, which is fascinating. So a non-Jew decides to bring an offering that has nisachim with it. Because the korban has to come in the nisachim, so we actually have to pay for it, like from the Bein HaMikdash's funds or something. It's really interesting. Okay, so but it's not mentioned here, so let's just stick with, okay, they don't bring nisachim. Aval korbanam ta'un nisachim, right? That's what they're saying. But we're stuck because their korban actually needs nisachim. Some people say, so you just can't do it properly. But anyway, there's a whole debate about this, not here. Divrei Rabbi Shimon. This is all Rabbi Shimon. I'm a Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi says, I think we're supposed to be strict about all these laws. And their sacrifice is subject to the exact same laws as us. Where do I get it from? Shene'amar bahem laHashem. Okay, the pasuk we said about the ish, that you want to bring any neder nidava, says, Asher yakrivu laHashem le'olah, that they will sacrifice to God as an olah. And he says, this is to God. So it's a sacrifice to God. What's the difference between their sacrifice and our sacrifice? It should have all the same laws. Now we go back to the statement of Rabbi Shimon, or presumably, there's a machloket about who this line refers to, but we're going to go with it. It goes back to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon's first thing was that there's no me'ilah. So now it says, when is there no me'ilah? B'kodshei mizbeach. That's if you offer, we're talking about animals or items that are going to be offered on the altar. Aval b'kodshei bedek habayit mo'alim behem. Okay, throughout kodshim, we're going to make these distinctions between kodshei bedek habayit and kodshei mizbeach. Kodshei mizbeach is what we also call kedushat haguf, where the object itself is sanctified. The kodshei bedek habayit means it goes for upkeep of the temple, and what it really means is it's kadosh kedushat damim. Its value is holy, but not the body of the item. That just means you have to give its value to the temple. It's just valuable for its value, not for its object. So now normally, kodshei mizbeach we're much more strict with. Kodshei bedek habayit we're more lenient with because it has only its value and not it itself is sanctified. But here it's actually the reverse. When we say there's no laws of me'ilah, it's by things that are offered on the altar. When we say, though, things that are sanctified because their value is sanctified, it goes to upkeep of the temple, for that there is me'ilah. If you misuse one of those things, it's a problem. Okay. This is interesting. We're going to get to where we get this from the psukim. But I think there's possibly, I'm suggesting, just a reason for it. The kodshei mizbeach are sacrifices that they bring. A sacrifice that they bring is between them and God. This has no effect on anyone else, right? Any of the Jews around. But the bedek habayit, if they give something for the upkeep of the temple, that's for all of us to benefit from. And then, perhaps the sanctity of that is the same then as anything else. And if there's me'ilah for us for bedek habayit, then there should be me'ilah for their items as well. Because it's something that isn't just, like a straight route between them and God that doesn't have any intersecting lines. But the bedek habayit, all of us are going to benefit from if we're benefiting from anything in the temple. So perhaps that's why there's me'ilah for that. Anyway, that's just a thought that I had about why this would be. It could be someone says it, I don't know, but I didn't see. Now we're going to move into, I want to point out one thing. Someone brought up, and this is also, Rabbi Elazar brought this up at the end of her shir. She ended with this question. I don't want to give away her shir, but there's a famous pasuk we all read about, and we sing it in our davening on Yamim Noraim, Ki beiti beit tefillah yikareh l'chol amim, right? Olotehem v'zivchehem l'ratzonom mizbechi. Their olot and their korbanot will be l'ratzonom mizbechi. By the way, that pasuk seems to imply not just olot, also zvachim, also shlamim, okay, which is not machloket, but so these are pasuk from the prophets to prove a halachic argument. They will be l'ratzon, and it's also talking about a future point, that they will be l'ratzonom mizbechi in the future. God will accept them. And we could talk about this later, actually, the word ratzon. It's interesting. It comes up in that pasuk. We're going to see later. Maybe it doesn't. That word is not associated with non-Jews. Ki beiti beit tefillah yikareh l'chol amim, because my house will become a house of prayer for all the nations. So Rabbi Elazar talks about, what's going to be in the future. Will there be more sacrifices of non-Jews? Like if we go back to statistics, right? Is the bulk of the sacrifice is going to be actually from non-Jews or not, right? So, right, will it shift at that point? It's a good question. Obviously, nobody knows the answer to that. Okay, now we're going to go through one by one and see the drashot for how we know these things are only for Jews. According to Rabbi Shimon again. Lo nehanim v'lo mo'alim. So first they explain what I already told you, which is lo nehanim mid'Rabbanan, but lo mo'alim, right? Okay, from a d'Rabbanan perspective, the rabbi said don't benefit from it. But really, there's no isur me'ilah from the Torah. How do we get that? Lo mo'alim. Degamar me'ilah chet mitruma. Okay, we're going to go through psukim now. Pasuk by me'ilah says, Nefesh ki timo mal v'chat'a b'shkagan. You sinned. And by truma, it says, V'shamur mishmarti v'lo yisu alav chet. Keep my truma safe, meaning don't get it impure and all that, don't ruin it, and you won't get a punishment, you won't have a sin on you. Chet, right? Umeitu ki chalalu. That's where it says you get the death penalty, right? That's what we just talked about yesterday. You get the death by the hands of God if you eat truma when you're impure. So now what do we learn now? So we learn this gzera shava. What's true for truma is true for me'ilah. Well, what's true for truma? Well, but truma k'tiv, b'nei Yisrael v'lo goyim. Okay, there it says specifically, v'lo yechalalu et kodshei b'nei Yisrael et asher yarimu laHashem. Okay, the kodshei b'nei Yisrael, that's the truma. It's the truma of b'nei Yisrael. That's only relevant to b'nei Yisrael. From the gzera shava, we move back to me'ilah. Ve'en chayavim ala mishum pigul notar v'tamei. Again, we're going to have a gzera shava. My time, Da'ate pigul. Okay, it's the same gzera shava we saw yesterday. Avon mi notar. V'ate notar chilu mituma. Ubetuma k'tiv. Okay, pigul is learned from notar. We still don't know where we get from notar. Notar is learned from tamei. Where do we get from tamei? Okay, I'm not going to go through this psukim because we saw them all yesterday. And betuma k'tiv b'nei Yisrael v'lo goyim. Okay, where does it say b'nei Yisrael? It says there, vayinazru. Remember that pasuk we saw yesterday? Vayinazru mikodshei b'nei Yisrael. V'lo yechalalu et shem kodshi asher heim makdishim li ani Hashem. We're going to go back to asher heim makdishim li. This was in the intro, the first pasuk about stay away, right, when you're impure from what? From kodshei b'nei Yisrael. Notice it says from the sacrifices of Jews. It didn't say sacrifices of non-Jews. Okay, and it specifically said Jews. Ve'ein osim tmura. My time. Now, in this time, instead of gzera shava, we're going to use a hekesh and another hekesh. So what's a hekesh? A juxtaposition. They're in the same pasuk, or they're right next to each other, pasuk right next to pasuk. Well, itakesh tmura l'maser behema. That's because the pasuk about maser behema, which is taking your 10th animal, it says in the pasuk about maser behema, you can't do tmura, lo yimirena, okay, don't substitute, right? You have to take the 10th animal and then don't switch it with another one, okay, if you like that 10th animal that came out. You can't switch it. So they're in the same pasuk, so we can learn one from the other. And b'maasel behema itakesh lemaaser dagan. Okay, so tmura is hekesh to maaser behema. And maaser behema comes up in the same pasuk as maaser dagan, where it talks about all the different maserot you take. There's maaser on your crops and there's maaser on your animals. Now we have to say maaser on your crops. How do we know it's only b'nei Yisrael? Maaser dagan k'tiv b'nei Yisrael v'lo goyim. Okay, there it says ki maaser b'nei Yisrael asher yarimu laHashem, etc. So there, the maaser asher yarimu maaser b'nei Yisrael. So the maaser on the crops is only b'nei Yisrael. From there, hekesh to the maaser on the animal. From there, hekesh to tmura. So now they say, wait a minute. Problem. What did we learn about kodshim? You can't learn a hekesh from a hekesh. You can't learn, do a juxtaposition on a juxtaposition. Okay? Masir dagan chulinhu. Oh, they say, well, the first one is not kodesh. Masir dagan, first of all, masir rishon you give to the Levi, but anyone actually can eat it. It's not sanctified at all. Masir sheni has a bit of sanctification because it has to be eaten in Jerusalem. But even though it has some sort of sanctification, when we say about this hekesh, we're talking about kodshim, things that are in the temple. Masir sheni doesn't have anything to do with the temple. So since the first thing is chulin, that hekesh doesn't count as a double hekesh, because you only can have a hekesh on a hekesh in kodshim. This sounds a little weird, and that's what the Gemara is going to say. Well, this makes sense. And that's if you go by, how do we determine is this a hekesh on a hekesh in kodshim? Do we determine it by the one you're learning it from, the melamed, which is what we're doing here? If you say it goes by the melamed, that determines whether it's chulin or kodesh for, right, whether or not you can do this hekesh, then it works. But if you say the thing we're trying to learn is kodshim, which actually would be more intuitive, that if that one's kodshim, then you can't do a hekesh on a hekesh, or the ma'ika l'meimar, then we're going to have a problem, because at the end, we're learning back to a t'mura on an animal that's being brought on the temple, on the altar. So, and in the temple. So, Ella, they're going to give a different explanation. Masir behema chova she'en kavu al azmanhu. Masir behema is obligatory, and it's an obligation that's not associated with time. Okay, you have to count your 10 and then bring it, but there's no time frame in which you have to bring it. Okay, or a specific time you have to bring it. Now, this time thing is not really so relevant. Okay, they try to explain why they bring in this factor of time, but I'm going to ignore it for right now, because what it really is saying is it's an obligatory offering. Now, obligatory offerings are not for Gentiles. We just said that, right? That's what we said in the beginning. They only can bring voluntary offerings. Since Masir is an obligatory offering, and they're going to learn from Masir to T'mura, then T'mura is only good because they're in the same pasuk. That's one hekesh. Then you're going to end up saying it's only Bnei Yisrael. Okay? So that's a chovah she'en kavua lazmanu. The chovah she'en lazman kavua. Yisrael maite goyim lo maite. Right? A chovah that doesn't have a set time. Even a chovah that has a set time. Okay, that's what I'm pointing out. Even when it has a set time, only Jews can bring in, not non-Jews, and therefore then we can make a hekesh from there to T'mura. Ein mevi'im nisachim. Okay, you don't bring libations. Tanu Rabbanan, why not? Why don't the Gentiles bring libations? Ezrach, okay, it says in the libation pasuk, this is in Bamidbar chapter 15, it talks about the libations. It says, Kol ha'ezrach yaseh kacha, any citizen will do this, et ele, or kacha et ele, does like this of these. Okay, we're going to get back to those words in a minute, that's why I'm reading them. Okay, so, but the main thing right now is ezrach. Ezrach is a citizen, meaning a Jew. Okay, ve'en hagoyim mevi nesachim. Yachol lo te'e olato tu'una nesachim. Now maybe then, when they bring a korban ola, as I said before, the ola comes in nesachim. So maybe they won't need to bring libations, but that's not what we learned, right? Talmud lamar kacha. Because kacha is, this is how it has to be done. So because this is how it has to be done, every time an ola is brought, it has to come with nesachim. On the other hand, they can't be obligated to bring it. Okay? So there's, right, they can't bring it themselves. So either they send a messenger to bring it, or it means maybe their money can't be used even for it, and then we have to bring it. But the korban has to come with nesachim. Amar Rabbi Yosi ro'ani b'kolam lachmir. Now we're just quoting back in the baraita, and then that line which we said, you can really ignore that they're quoting Rabbi Yosi, because really what they want to quote is this last line, which actually, the way we understood it, relates to Rabbi Shimon. There is a way to explain it like Rabbi Yosi, but we're not going to do that now. And it goes all the way back to Me'ila. Me'ila is only in Kodesh Mizbeach, not in, right, that thing that sounded counterintuitive, not in Kodesh Bet Abaye. My time. Well, let's go back to our Me'ila drasha. How did we learn it? From Truma. So, Kigamra Me'ila, Chet Mitruma. When we learn Me'ila, we learned it from Chet from Truma. Dumia de Truma, so it has to be like Truma. The Kadisha Kedusha Guf. Truma is Kedusha Guf. So if they're going to learn there's no Me'ila, there's no Me'ila like there's no Truma, and Truma is something that's inherently has sanctity. Therefore, we're learning there's no Me'ila for things in sacrifices that are inherently sanctified, but not in Bet HaKabayit. Ava Kedusha Bet HaKabayit, the Kedusha Tamim lo, right? So Kedusha Bet HaKabayit, which is its value, is not relevant. Okay, so that was the whole list in the baraita, and then we saw where we darshaned it from. Notice they didn't go back to shkutei chutz and show where we know that one. And now, which was in the Mishnah and wasn't in the baraita, this just seems to be an analysis of all the cases in the baraita, which most of them were in our Mishnah as well. In other words, some of them, right? In other words, it covered all the other cases in our Mishnah. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to bring a baraita that's going to relate to this machlokes Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Shimon. Okay, so we're going to relate it, or the Gemara is going to relate it. Tanu Rabbanan. Dam shenitma uzrako. Okay, maybe before we read, we should just talk about the tzitz. The tzitz was this head plate that the Kohen Gadol wore, and when he wore it, it would atone for any kind of tumah in the mikdash. So let's say someone accidentally was dealing with something and they were impure and they didn't realize. Then and then they continued to do the korban, okay, or the korban became tamei and they continued to do the process. So instead of saying, it's completely disqualified, if the tzitz, if the Kohen Gadol is there wearing the tzitz, it atones for that. And then the sacrifice is as if it was done properly, okay, it gets accepted. So dam shenitma, that's what we're saying right now. The blood, let's say, became impure, uzrako, and they put it on the altar anyway. Bis shogeg, if they did it not knowing, unwittingly, hurtza. So the tzitz is maratza. That's what it means, hurtza. The tzitz atones for it. And what's hurtza? Ritzui. We saw that before, right? Liratzon. Right? I forgot where it appeared, but there was this ratzon. Liratzon Hashem. God accepts it, basically. Turning now to Amubet. B'mezid lo hurtza. But if it was done intentionally, then no. So b'med v'rei mamurim. What is this said for? B'yachid. This is all an individual. Aval b'tzibor. We know already tuma hutra b'tzibor. You don't need the tzitz to atone for it. Bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid hurtza. So you get ritzui, whether it's shogeg, whether it's mezid. It even allows the ratzonim is b'chi. Thank you with the sacrifices in the future. Thank you of the non-Jews. So now b'tzibor bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid hurtza. Okay, so if you do it even intentionally, then there's ritzui. Because of tumah hutra b'tzibor, we're always lenient when it comes to tumah in the tzibor, so the tzitz can atone for it also. Here comes the line though. Uva goyim, non-Jews, bein b'shogeg u bein b'mezid lo hurtza. The tzitz is not maratza at all. Shogeg, mezid doesn't matter. There's no ritzui for their korbanot. That's why I said specifically that pasuk l'ratzonim is b'chi. Here they're saying there's no ritzui for non-Jews. Rabbanan came to Rav Papa. So the rabbis came before Rav Papa and said, "Come on, dilo ke Rabbi Yosi. This seems to not be like Rabbi Yosi. Why not like Rabbi Yosi? Di Rabbi Yosi ha'amar b'kulan ani ro'elach mil." What's Rabbi Yosi's approach? And he says, I think you should be stringent in all of them, which really means I view their sacrifices as identical. They're the same thing as ours. They have all the same rules. If all the same rules apply, right? Lahachmir, well then all the same rules should apply lakula, right? We should be also lenient. If the tzitz atones, and if everything else is the same, then the tzitz, which atones for our sin, our korbanot that are done with a mistake, should atone for their sin, their korbanot that were done by mistake, that they were brought b'tumah. So this must be that this baraita is not like Rabbi Yosi. That's what the rabbis say to Rav Papa. But Rav Papa disagrees. Amar lehu Rav Papa, he said to them, Afilu tema Rabbi Yosi. I'll explain this baraita according to Rabbi Yosi. Shanei hatam da amar kran. He's going to bring them a simple drasha. It says in the pasuk about the tzitz, the end of the pasuk, Shmot kafchet lamed chet, v'haya al mitzchot tamid. It should be on its forehead always. Liratzon lahem lifnei Hashem, to be ritzui, right? Liratzon, to be accepting, to them before God. Who's to them if not the Jews? It's for the Jews it's referring to. Okay? Now, it also said in the pasuk, it's nasat avon kodeshim asher yakdishu b'nei Yisrael. I don't know why he didn't quote that part of the pasuk, but he quotes the word lahem. Lahem v'lo legoyim. I think because the ratzon comes right next to the word lahem. So they want it, and the lahem, I think what he's saying is it obviously refers back to what it said b'nei Yisrael in the pasuk. The problem is that Amalei Rav Huna Bereid Rav Natan the Rav Papa Elameata. Wait a minute though. If you're going to say that, look at this other pasuk where it also says Mikotche b'nei Yisrael, and then it says Asher He Makdishim, right? The word Asher He Makdishim is this whole thing of Tuma, right? And then it says Mikotche b'nei Yisrael Asher He Makdishim li, and that applies according to Rabbi Yosi. Tuma, right, is also going to be a problem if you eat a korban that was sacrificed b'tuma. He thinks that of non-Jews it's going to be a problem. Now you're going to say, Haim velo goyim. If you're going to say that Rabbi Yosi agrees, and because of the lahem, he says, that's why they're out. Also that it says Haim, and they should be out there. And he does it. He puts tuma, right? Tamei is one of the things he lists on his list. So Elam Rav Ashi brings a different proof to prove a different source to prove Rav Papa, or a different, right? He says, Amakra liratzon lahem. Maybe he's even just correcting or saying, you missed what Rav Papa was saying. It's because it says liratzon lahem. God accepts, right? It wants to be liratzon. Okay, it's hard to explain exactly the word ratzon. Ratzon is desire, but it's also, here it's ritzoy, to appease. It's for appeasement for God. Okay, now, they say, v'goyim lav b'nei hartza'aninu. Even if their sacrifices, this is the way that Rav Ashi's understanding, and Rav Papa sort of, he's explaining within Rav Papa, is explaining Rabbi Yosi's position. Rabbi Yosi thinks their sacrifices are identical, but that's because they sanctified something, and it's a sacrifice, and then it fits into the world of sacrifices. But as people, and as if you want to focus, the tzitz is focusing on ritzoy for them, for the people. The people are different. God has ritzoy, in other words, while he might accept sacrifices of non-Jews, this special place the Jewish people have, because of that, like God allows their, right, it's like almost like a lifnim shurat hadin, right, beyond the law. God says, I'm going to create this thing called the tzitz, and if the Kohen Gadol wears it, I'm going to accept mistakes you make. That's just for Jews. Okay? There we're going to make a distinction, because that relates to the people. And there, we're not going to extend that to non-Jews as well. Okay, why is a good question. Okay, but that's the distinction between the object of the sacrifice, that's exactly the same, versus the person who's doing it. It's just, like I said, it's a very interesting topic, and that's why I recommend you listen to Gefet, where really, if you delve into the Rishonim also, you get more of a perspective on these differences in the approaches, these two approaches that start there and then develop over time of why theoretically their sacrifices should be any different. It's a really good question. Okay, new Mishnah. Dvarim she'en chayavim alehem mishum pigul. Now we're going to Mishnayot back to the one we did yesterday. Pigul, you're only liable for eating. Remember, it's the eating of the food. If it was something that had a matir, remember, but not the kometz, not the lavona, not the ketoret, right? All these things that don't have something that permits them to be burned on the altar or permits them to be whatever, right? That, there's no pigul. So, these things that we saw before, the ein chayavim alehem mishum pigul, chayavim alehem mishum notar, mishum tamei. Even though we have this threesome that usually goes together, this trio of notar, tamei, pigul, notar, and tamei, in this area they're split, okay? Notar and tamei are on one side. You're actually liable for all those things. It's not a criteria that in order to be chayav for eating notar, or eating something that became impure, sacrificial item that became impure, there you're going to be liable, even if it's not a davar that has a matir to it. Chutz min adam, other than blood. Blood, there's going to be a unique exception. We're going to learn that later, where they get that from. Rabbi Shimon, now, if you remember in that list, there were all sorts of things that you don't generally eat, okay? Like lavona, frankincense, okay? That's like a type of incense. We don't eat that, okay? So, Rabbi Shimon mechayev b'davar shedar kan le'echol. He says you're only chayev in that list of things for pigul and for notar and tamei if they're edible. If they're not edible, you're not chayev at all because they're not edible. If you would eat something not edible, you wouldn't be chayev. Aval ha'itzim. So the wood or lavona or the ketoret, the wood that gets burnt on the altar, or the lavona or the ketoret or the incense, ein chayavim alav mishum tuma. You're not going to be chayev tuma for those things. He doesn't mention notar, by the way. There's big machloket about whether notar is included here or not. He just said tuma, and he meant also notar, because we'll see even the laws of notar here are learned from tuma. The Tosefta actually has tuma of a notar in there. Some people think he just tuma and not notar, but anyway, that's a side point. Tanu Rabbanan. So now we're going to see where we get this from, and we're going to see why we need a special drasha to do it. Like, why would you even thought that we're going to learn from pigul to notar and tamei? Tanu Rabbanan. So here's a baraita that expands on the Mishnah. You might have thought that maybe for tuma, they're starting with tuma, you would think that it's like pigul, only things that have a matir. Why would you think that? Right? Why? What did that have to do with anything? Well, vidinu. It would be logical. Why? Uma pigul, notar is part of the trio. Why you think not? I see you're asking a question, right? It's pigul, notar, tamei. Those are the trio. Okay? So now, you would have thought, from pigul we could learn to tuma. Why? pigul shehu bikvi'ah ubiyidiyah velo tarmichalo. There's three stringencies about it. Number one, you have to bring a set korban. Okay, we're going to compare this in a minute to tumah, where you don't. Okay, tumah is the olav yored. You could, if you can't afford it, you could bring the cheaper options. Ubiyidiyah. Okay, this brings us back to shvuot and yidiyot, tumah shtayin shein arba and all that. What's yidiyot? You have to have in tumah. You have to know at the beginning either you were tamei or the object was tamei. Forget. Do what you did, and then remember. Here, you could not realize you did a pigul thought at all, like you have it all, there's no yidiyah you need in the beginning, and then you realize later after you did it, okay, that you messed up. So you be chayiv anyway. You don't need to have known it also in the beginning. V'lo hutar michlalo, and there's no sort of heter for it. Tumah hutar b'tzibur. Remember, if the majority of the people are tamei, it's permitted. So it's obviously more stringent, and yet it's limited. So tumah, right? In other words, it's only something that has a matir. You won't be chayiv if you ate something that doesn't have a matir to it. Tumah, remember, that's something that enables it to be done that stage. Tumah, but something impure, shiba olav yored, or if you ate something impure and that became impure in the temple, and you have to bring a sliding scale offering only. You can bring a very cheap one if you can't afford it. Ub'shtei idiyot, you have to have knowledge before and after. V'utra michalam, we have this tumah hutra b'tzibur. Eino din she'eino chayav el davar sheyesh lo mitirim ben l'adam ben l'mizbech. Wouldn't you think then, if this is more stringent, right? If the laws of pigul are more strict and yet they're limited, so when it's more lenient, shouldn't it be only, right? It would include less things, you would think. So it would include at least, right, it wouldn't include the things that are not included in pigul. Talmud Lomar, that's why we need a pasuk to teach tumah. And this is where we're going to get the law, that tumah applies across the board, even in Devar She'en Lo Mitirim, Asher He Makdishim Li. We saw already that pasuk includes things. Yesterday it included other things. It's an inclusive pasuk. Anything they sanctify to me, okay, is going to be a problem. That's the tumah pasuk. Vayinasru, stay away from the Bnei Yisrael, the Kochei Bnei Yisrael, that become impure. Stay away from them. Or anything they're makdishim, which, yesterday we included ofod and menachot and nisachim. Here we're saying also it just means even if it doesn't have a matir. Yachol miyad, okay, here's just the baraita going on something else. You might have thought from an earlier stage, the tumah isser kicks in. Talmud Lomar yikrav, okay, this is from the pasuk. It says, it's a weird pasuk, we read it yesterday, and I think I even mentioned this was a little strange. And more lehem l'dorotechem, Kol ish asher yikrav mikol zarachem et kodashim asher yikdishu b'nei Yisrael Hashem b'tumato alav. If you, now yikrav literally means you get close to. Okay, it sounds like it's saying if you get close to and touch it. Now, and then you get curried if you touch something impure, that was a sanctified item that was impure. Now, the Gemara says, this obviously doesn't mean yikrav. Touch it. Amar Rabbi Elazar v'chi yesh nogeah shu chayav. Someone who touches something is going to get curried. That's a very severe punishment for just touching something that's impure. Right? And they're basically saying it must be you ate it, not you touched it. Ella, so then why does it say yikrav? Well, yikrav also means la'akriv, to sacrifice. So what do they learn from here? It only kicks in the isser tumah at the stage when it's yukrav. It's ra'oi lahakriv. Okay, what does this mean? Haketzad. Well, yesh lo mitirim, if it has something that matirs it to be burned or matirs it to be eaten, then it's mishikruvu matirav. Like if putting the blood on the altar allows the meat to be eaten, then that's the stage where the tumah issue kicks in. If ein lo mitirim, like the komets, which just goes straight on the altar, mishikadesh b'kli. When you put it in the sanctified vessel, that's when the tumah issue starts. It doesn't start in an earlier stage, like when you sanctify the animal. Even when you slaughter the animal, it doesn't, because that's not a machshir. Okay? Eshkechan tumah. Notar minalan. Okay, that gave us tumah. So that was the source again. We just got sidetracked by this miyad, you would have thought, and we just learned that. But the real issue was tumah, we had the pasuk. You would have thought from pigul, maybe it's only got what pigul has, it's limited. But no, it says asher hamakdishim. So now where do we get notar from? Very simply, we have the Gzeira Shava that we've mentioned a bunch of times already. It says chilul by tumah, it says chilul by notar, so notar is going to be like tamei. But what's the problem? We also said that pigul. But this also Gzeira Shava to pigul. If pigul is limited to only if yesh lo mitirim, tumah is everything. Well, you could learn notar from that, and you could learn it from that. So now attempt number one is going to be, well, I'll tell you why we should learn from tumah, not from notar, because it's going to be more similar to Tumah. And then we're going to say, what do you mean? It's more similar to pigul in more ways. Okay, so we're going to start with Tumah. Stabra Tumah Havalei Lamelech, Sheken Gazal Siman. We have Gimel Zayin Lamed, Guf, the object. In notar and Tumah, the object becomes tamei. In pigul, it's just thought. Zayin is zrika. Zrika is what makes the item pigul. If you don't sprinkle the blood, remember, it doesn't become pigul. It becomes pigul, even if your thought was before. But if you didn't sprinkle the blood, it's not pigul. Zrika is what sets that this is pigul. Now, notar and tamei become pigul. Tamei become problematic. Tumah, when it gets impure, okay, at the moment it gets impure, and notar, when it's left over beyond its given time. It has nothing to do with zrika. And chet is chilul, okay, lamed is chilul, even though it should be chet, but lamed, it has the letter lamed in the word chilul, it has the same words. Now, the Gemara says, what do you mean? What about adrab? Pigul havalei lamelech. Should learn from pigul. Shkein hutar, tzitz, tahor, bisman, karev. Okay, these are 5 ways it's similar to pigul, which is hutal. Okay, tumah. These are ways it's not. Okay, notar and pigul are not hutal. There's no heter for them. There is a heter for tumah, bitzibor, in public, right, with the majority of the people. Tzitz, the tzitz only atones for tumah, not for notar and pigul. Okay, if you did notar and pigul, that doesn't cover you at all. Tahor, okay. Tahara has to do with the tumah case. It doesn't have anything to do with notar and pigul. It's a little bit of a strange one. They try to explain it, but it's a little weird. I mean, obviously it doesn't. It's not tamei. But okay, we'll put that one aside. Bisman, they both have to do with time. Notar and pigul are a thought beyond the time, or you eat it beyond the time. Karev, it's the object that's sacrificed becomes disqualified, whereas tumah, it could be that, but it could be also a person who gets tamei and then eats meat while they're tamei. So those are the ways, 5 ways it's similar. And that's more than 3. So attempt number 2, and with this we'll finish. Elami detani levi. Detani levi, minayin sha'af b'psula zman ha'katuv medaber. How do you know that the pasuk about tumah also includes notar, which is the disqualification of time? Talmud lomar v'lo yechalelu et kodshei b'nei Yisrael. That was the pasuk by tumah that we saw. The chilul, right? Now, it could have said lo yachelu, because what's chilul? It's to make it chulin, chol, like something that's not kodesh, the opposite of kodesh. B'shnei chilulim ha'katuv medaber, chabsul notar v'chabsul tumah. So the extra lamed here in the word includes something else, must be including notar. Okay, so let's do a quick review. We started with this halacha, we paskin halacha about the chatot pnimiyot, and they said, why on earth are we paskin halacha for something that's going to happen in the future? That we got off on a bit of a tangent. Then we talked about sacrifices of non-Jews, and Rabbi Shimon's position. We went through each of the drashot about why he thinks that they're not included in all these laws, and we had the baraita that expanded on it, and we discussed Rabbi Yosi's opinion, which says, no, they're completely the same, although with the tzitz, even though he thinks they're not, or at least Rav Papa and Rav Ashi thought to say that even works with his opinion. The rabbis thought, what do you mean? It's not his opinion. He thinks it's completely the same, including the tzitz. And then we got to this Mishnah, which basically said the limitations on pigul are not true for tumah and notar, and that we just darshan from psukim from tumah, and then from there notar was learned from tumah because it's kind of hidden in the word chilul in the tumah pasuk. That's it. We're finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day.